95 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, pursuant to the standing orders, and therefore members are attending in person in the room, as well as remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of members and witnesses. Before speaking, please do wait until I recognize you by name. You may speak in the official language of your choice. Although this room is equipped with a powerful audio system, feedback events can occur. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to a microphone. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. With regard to a speaking list, the committee clerk is attempting to make sure that we comply with the members' requests. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I am informing the committee that all witnesses appearing virtually have completed the required connection tests. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, November 8th, 2023, the committee will resume its study of Canada's diplomatic capacity. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, again, I just wanted to inform everyone that witnesses appearing before us virtually have completed the required tests in advance of this meeting. Now I'd like to welcome our witnesses. We have with us today in person Professor Caron, who is with the Department of Political Science. Oh, sorry, my apologies. Professor Carvin, professor with the Norman Paterson School of Norman Paterson School. We also have here in person Professor Jeannot, who's the professor with the Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. We also have with us, joining virtually, Mr. Ambassador Bonifant, who unfortunately, from what I am informed, does not have the proper headset, and so the interpreters are unable to provide interpretive services. Yes. 1 second, please. So unfortunately, from what I am told, can I ask the witness? Okay. The interpreters have informed me that Ambassador Bonifant does not have the appropriate headset, but we will endeavor, and this is up to the members, to try to schedule an alternative date on which we can benefit from the perspective of Ambassador Bonifant. We also have, we're also very pleased to have here with us today Ms. Farida Deef, the Canadian Director of Human Rights Watch. So each a witness will be provided 5 minutes. Yes, MP Chateau.
Est-ce que je peux me permettre un commentaire?
May I make a comment regarding Mr. Bonifant's testimony? Yes, go ahead. 2 things. First of all, if Mr. Bonifant could remain a little bit longer so that at least I could submit various questions that I had for him, for this excellent witness. I was so eager to meet him. I had questions to ask him which were very important for this study. So perhaps if Mr. Bonifant would agree, I would like to be able to ask my questions so as to give him an opportunity to answer in writing in the event that he would be unable to join us at another time. And the second thing that I would like to raise is this. We have a Board of Internal Economy meeting. I've forgotten the French term. I apologize. But I would like us to ask this committee to reassess our particular situation at the Foreign Affairs Committee, because we have witnesses who are coming from abroad. Obviously, this is the nature of the committee. There isn't always the right time to have the necessary material based on the rules. The demands are quite specific. Would it be possible to ask the committee to provide solutions for us in this kind of situation? Because what's happening is that we can't question witnesses. So ask for a solution so that that solution could be provided by that committee to our committee. Thank you.
Chattel, thank you for your intervention. I completely agree with you, and I'm sure everyone else does as well. We were all looking very much forward to hear from the ambassador. But unfortunately, the interpreters have advised me that they are unable to do so. However, to work around that, we have sent messages to the ambassador if he can confirm what the make of his headphone is. If we do receive that confirmation, then we will definitely have the benefit of hearing from him today. As for the other question that you have raised, if I may, perhaps we should talk about that during committee business, which is the last half an hour of today's meeting. Are you okay with that? In committee business? Excellent. Okay, so we will start off with the witnesses. Our apologies. Professor Carvin, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. That is true for all three of the witnesses we are going to be hearing from today. If I do hold up this phone, that means you're very, very close to the time limit, and that does not only apply to opening remarks, it also applies when members are asking you questions because they're given a specific time slot. So if anyone does see this go up, please do try to wrap it up in 10 to 20 seconds. Professor Carvin, the floor is yours. Again, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. I will advise the committee I have provided longer, true professorial fashion, I have provided longer comments, but I will, in the interest of 5 minutes, I will be much more brief. I suspect it's fairly well known that Lester B. Pearson once described foreign policy as domestic policy with its hat on, and Pierre Elliott Trudeau described it as the extension abroad of national policies. Yet it is seldom that we see our policymakers treat foreign policy in this way. Foreign affairs is often treated as an afterthought, a luxury rather than an instrument of state power that can further both our domestic and international interests abroad. Diplomacy is seen as a reward for friendship rather than a tool that will ensure our interests, but also reach across divides when difficult conversations need to take place. It's understandable why this is the state of affairs. We live in a very safe neighborhood compared to a lot of our friends and allies. We've had the blessing of not having to worry about our security. And I don't think I need to emphasize the point that these circumstances are rapidly changing. Daily headlines about war, foreign interference, espionage, cyber attacks, and the suffering of refugees and internally displaced persons in the context of an international order under stress are reminder enough. The point is that we were once insulated from many of the world's most difficult challenges, but this is no longer the case. And we no longer have the freedom to ignore the world outside our window. To address these problems, we need a foreign affairs department that can navigate these uncertain waters. And to this end, I wish to raise several points for the committee's consideration. First, and I think most importantly, human resources issues at Global Affairs Canada, by all accounts, are in somewhat dire straits. The recruitment process is archaic, chaotic, and not suited to the 21st century. To give just one example, it seems a significant percentage of the workforce are young master's students or young graduates on 90-day contracts. These temporary employees are constantly faced with the prospect of imminent unemployment and are constantly looking for the next opportunity. To be frank, it is very odd if I attend a meeting at Global Affairs and I am confronted with students who are currently in my own class. This has happened multiple times. This is not how you build a workforce, and therefore I'm strongly recommending or endorsing the recommendations 9 through 13 on hiring and training of Global Affairs Canada staff in the December 2023 Senate report, More Than a Vocation, that I suspect you're already familiar with. Secondly, Canada's lack of a foreign policy is frankly bizarre, especially for a G7 country. When you ask about it, the result is often disappointing as well. We're told that creating a foreign policy is too hard, too challenging, that circumstances change too fast, and that it's not a priority to signal to our allies what our intentions are because they can just pick up a phone and talk to us. We have had a much delayed Indo-Pacific policy, a defense policy that is yet to reemerge, and the downgrading of a promised Africa strategy to a framework last year. So it's clear that we are struggling to write foreign policy documents. And I wonder if this is partially because we're simply out of practice in doing so. Other countries, they release on a fairly regular basis documents. And I think there's a lot of advantages to having a foreign policy. It forces choices and it forces priorities. And yes, prioritization is difficult and requires difficult discussions, or positions can change in light of new events. But the answer is updating that policy, not eschewing the exercise altogether. And I think it's also an important communications tool. This is always downgraded by, especially people who worked at Foreign Affairs. They don't see this as a communication tool. I would just travel to Japan a week and a half ago. And in preparation, I looked at their diplomatic blue book. It's 400 pages. Now, do we need a 400-page book on foreign affairs? Absolutely not. But I think a clear strategic document that conveys our interest to not only our allies, but also Canadians, is definitely within our interest. And the other points I'd like to raise today will kind of reflect and I think reinforce this point. The third issue is Global Affairs' ability to give timely and useful advice to policymakers at the center of government. I know my colleague Thomas Junot is going to speak about intelligence and global affairs, and I think this plays a part. It's hard, right? It's hard to coordinate these things, but anecdotally you hear tales of challenges in providing this advice. It's not only a global affairs problem, but better training needs to be given to global affairs staff to provide that timely advice that can really help influence the situation when it comes to timely decision-making in an evolving situation. A fourth issue is mission creep. The Senate report I mentioned earlier, More Than a Vocation, suggests that GAC should be considered a central agency, quote, with responsibility for coordinating Canada's approach to international policy files across the federal government, end quote. It's recommendation 28. I really disagree with this. I think this is a bad idea. And I'm concerned that in lieu of direction that would be provided by a foreign policy, GAC has a mission creep problem. It's true that every issue in government does have an international dimension and that GAC is the lead on foreign affairs, but it's impossible for GAC to have a lead in all of these areas. For example, I know that they're aware of, so I'm going to run out of my other points. Maybe you can ask me later, but you'll see them in here. But I think we have to be aware that, GAC needs to kind of stick to its mandate. I think I can kind of finish by just saying, the final things would be Canada's ability to sustain its engagement. These are questions being asked by our allies. They see our Indo-Pacific policy, they're happy. But do we have what it takes to actually stay in that region and keep committing to those relationships that we're presently building? Finally, I'll say, one, we need to improve our presence abroad. This matters to our allies. They care about us. And it's much easier to think about Canada if you just have to go down the street and not 3 countries on the same continent, right? It's much easier that way. And finally, GAC, I think, has a communications problem. We need better transparency, better communications with Canadians, particularly, if we're going to reinvest in this capacity, we have to explain to Canadians why it's in their interest to do so. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor Carvin. We next go to Professor Junot. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the offer to speak today. So I will focus on 3 things today. One, the foreign ministry we need for tomorrow is one that should work seamlessly with intelligence. 2, we do not have that at this point. And 3, what can we do to get to that point? So first, very quickly, the foreign ministry for tomorrow is one that should be able to work seamlessly with the intelligence community. This is necessary to deal with a lot of the international threats that we face today. Think about foreign electoral interference, transnational repression, economic espionage, transnational terrorism, the security implications of climate change, and so on. Concretely, this means that Global Affairs Canada has to work closely with CSIS, CSC, DND, Canadian Forces Intelligence Command, and others in the security and intelligence community, and also beyond Ottawa, to deal with these and other threats. The second point I'd make is that the foreign ministry we need for tomorrow, one that can work seamlessly with the intelligence community, is not what we have right now. To be more specific, I would emphasize that the situation today is much better than it was 10 or 15 years ago. Intelligence works with the policy community much better. This is something that Professor Carvin and I have argued in some of our research, but we still have a long way to go. Too often, our diplomatic and intelligence worlds speak different languages and fail to work with each other in a coherent way. That means sharing information in a timely way. It means coordinating policies and operations. Some of the blame has to go to the intelligence community for this. It remains too insular and too disconnected from the needs of policy. But some of the blame also has to go to the diplomatic side, where culturally the bureaucracy remains too neglectful of all things intelligence, again, despite recent progress. One way to illustrate this, our diplomatic service has a low intelligence literacy. This means that even though some individual diplomats have a solid experience of how intelligence can help them in their work, collectively, the overall understanding of intelligence, an understanding of how to integrate it in their work remains below the level of the diplomatic services of some of our key allies. And I would note, by the way, that the reverse is true. And also problematic, that our intelligence community has a low policy literacy, but that's not our focus here today. This has consequences. We saw the tip of the iceberg of these problems emerge in debates about foreign interference in recent months, information not flowing efficiently, different parts of the government failing to understand each other, and so on. And what this means concretely is that the ceiling for success in our ability to counter foreign interference or other threats that we face will remain lower than it could be as long as we don't improve the relationship between the diplomatic and intelligence arms of national power. So 3, what can we do to better integrate our diplomatic and intelligence functions? 1, and this is a bit in line with what Professor Carvin says, we need a comprehensive review of our national security architecture, which is outdated. This can include reforming our intelligence priorities process, sclerotic, improving information sharing mechanisms, reviewing and adjusting governance structures, including those that should allow for better coordination and information sharing with other levels of government, with the private sector, with civil society, tackling a major human resource crisis, as Professor Carvin discussed, dealing with the epidemic of overclassification, which I've discussed in other committees recently, which remains a major obstacle to making better use of intelligence, including in global affairs, reviewing training programs. Point 2, more transparency and engagement, as Professor Carvin mentioned, with the public, with civil society, with the private sector. This is essential to bring in new ideas, to reinforce a stronger challenge function, which is lacking in the department, and to reinforce accountability mechanisms by better shining a light on weaknesses. 3, secondments and exchanges. We need our diplomats to spend more time working outside global affairs, in the intelligence community and elsewhere for that matter. This is the best way to build a mutual understanding and to deepen institutional linkages. 4, in an ideal world, we should have a foreign human intelligence agency, which we don't have. Realistically, that is unlikely to happen, at least for the foreseeable future. Until we have one, we should use existing structures and existing authorities and improve them to collect and then use more and better foreign intelligence. CSIS, CSC, CFINTCOM, and so on, something that both of us have written together about in recent times. And in a world of growing uncertainty in terms of our relations with the US, we should push to further Canadianize our collection and our analysis of foreign intelligence to work through a lens of more properly Canadian interests. 5, building on this, we should continue our ongoing efforts, which are ongoing, to develop our intelligence diplomacy capacity, which GAC and CSIS should do in tandem, not always easy, and diversify also our foreign intelligence relations, and to better leverage these partnerships. And last, and I'll finish on this, To do this, we need sustained leadership at the political level and at the bureaucratic level, which currently is lacking to really invest the time necessary to push these administrative reforms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jeannot. We next go to Ms. Farida Deef from Human Rights Watch. Welcome back, Ms. Deef. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and honourable members, for inviting me to discuss Canada's diplomatic capacity in these very turbulent and unpredictable times. This study could not be timelier. It will not come as a surprise that I'll focus on human rights, which I believe should constitute the moral backbone of Canadian diplomacy. As the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights has said, human rights is the antidote to the prevailing politics of distraction, deception, indifference, and repression. It's clear that the deeply troubling state of affairs that we're witnessing globally is fueled by impunity for human rights violations, by the uneven application of international law, and the perception that some governments can commit grave crimes and get away with it. With that said, I will focus today on Canada's efforts to advance justice and accountability for serious international crimes and the increasingly glaring double standards that erode Canada's credibility, and have profound repercussions for Canadians and people around the world. As you know, Canada was instrumental in the creation of the current international framework for the prevention of mass atrocities. It has also been a leading voice for international accountability, playing a central role in establishing the ICC and more recently supporting efforts to address grave crimes in Syria, Myanmar, and Ukraine. The Canadian government's position vis-à-vis the current crisis in Gaza departs significantly from Canada's storied legacy of action. Since the beginning of this conflict, this government has avoided condemning any specific war crimes in Gaza, instead repeating broad and general guidance for all parties to abide by international law. While Russia's indiscriminate airstrikes on hospitals and schools in Ukraine were rightly condemned, Israel has repeatedly carried out similar attacks without much in the way of condemnation from Ottawa. The international community rightly condemned President Bashar al-Assad's denial of food and water to civilians in Aleppo, but Canada failed to condemn Israel's use of starvation as a method of warfare in Gaza. Similarly, Canada has been a global leader to ban explosive weapons like landmines and cluster munitions, endorsing a new political declaration on explosive weapons. But the government directly undermined these efforts by remaining silent on Israel's recent use of white phosphorus in populated areas in Gaza and in Lebanon. The government's problematic response to the ICJ's recent ruling on Israel further undermines its stated commitment to a global rules-based order, highlighting its double standards when it comes to Israel, which may also signal that it does not need to comply with the order, sending a dangerous message to other states before international bodies. When Canadian diplomacy deviates from international law, it has harmful consequences for Canada far beyond Gaza. Statements by Canadian officials on atrocities anywhere in the world will ring hollow, making it harder to hold perpetrators accountable and deter future international crimes. Pressure by Canada on warring parties to abide by the laws of war in other conflicts will no doubt also carry less weight. These dangerous double standards unfortunately extend to consular affairs. I have appeared before this committee to highlight the utterly dire situation facing Canadian men, women, and children arbitrarily detained in northeast Syria for suspected ISIS ties. We have, at Human Rights Watch, along with a range of UN experts, including the UN Secretary General, repeatedly called on Canada to repatriate citizens for rehabilitation, reintegration, and prosecution as warranted. But while some of these Canadian women and children have been repatriated following a court case, many remain unlawfully detained, in addition to all Canadian men. To date, none of the Canadians who have been detained for close to 7 years have received any consular assistance. In doing so, Canada is flouting not only its international legal obligations, but its own guidelines to intervene when citizens abroad face serious abuses, including risks to life, torture, and inhuman and degrading treatment. In January 2021, Global Affairs adopted a consular policy framework specific to this group of citizens that makes it near impossible for them to return home. Among the eligibility criteria for repatriation is a change in medical condition, but the government knows full well that there's little to no chance of these detainees accessing medical care without Canada's assistance. I'd like to remind you, finally, that in June 2021, the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development made concrete recommendations on the provision of consular assistance to this very group of Canadian detainees. This has unfortunately fallen on deaf ears. Global Affairs has provided no consular assistance to the detainees, done little to nothing to support their relatives here in Canada, some of whom are just pleading for proof of life for their loved ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Deef. Good. We will now turn to the members for questions. And as I understand it, MP Chong, you're up first, and you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing. I noted that in the 2023 article you both published in International Journal, you said that countries are increasingly invited to international coalitions because they are willing and able to bring something to the table, not because of who they are or what they represent. In an era of resurgent great power competition, this material factor is likely to dominate the creation of international coalitions going forward. You also added that the 21st century will be more like a potluck than a party. One must bring something to be invited. So in that context, in the context of your opening remarks, perhaps you could tell us what capabilities does Canada presently have to bring to the potluck, and what capabilities does Canada lack?
Sir, nothing makes an academic happier than when you cite their article, so I'm going to thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing this. I think there's actually quite a few. And then there are ones we have to make decisions about. Canada has very good capability in the Arctic, for example. We have good intelligence in the Arctic, and this is increasingly being considered not an endorsement of mine, but it's increasingly considered a zone of potential conflict in the future, something that our European allies are particularly worried about and will be certainly a focus of NATO going forward. This is an area we definitely have a lot of capacity. Similarly, we have good, I've been told we have very good capacity on Russia. Obviously, this is something that is very much in the news and very much at the presence of our allies as well. So these are niche capabilities. We also have just within our own community, we have the entire our tech sector is fantastic. AI, we are absolutely leaders. We have innovation in multiple areas that will be of interest, and we've noticed this with a number of attempts to actually steal this information and get access to our intellectual property. So I think these are areas which we could leverage, but we have to make decisions. The problem is, and both Tama and I have professors. We're being formal. Sorry, professors. And I. We've engaged with our allies, and they'll often say to us, when Canada goes to meetings, they don't say anything. They don't give their opinion. Sometimes they bring talking points, but we have to actually make. We have all these things that we could bring to the potluck, but we're just not making our decisions. Some of our closest allies have told us, we're waiting for you to tell us what you can bring. It's not that they're asking for things and we're saying no. It's that they're saying, okay, what are you going to bring? And we seem to be in a huddle formation without being able to provide an answer. So I think it's just, honestly, I'm waiting for Global Affairs and Department of Defense and all these things to tell us and to tell our allies what they can bring.
So thank you. And the article was written in reference to AUKUS specifically, but it's a point that we do think is applicable far beyond that more and more ad hoc coalitions will be built on the basis of what do you bring to the table as opposed to do we think you're nice. And from a Canadian perspective, that's a problem. I would also add, in addition to what Professor Carvin mentioned, that the lack of a Canadian ability in many cases, not systematically, to bring something to the table and to contribute concretely is causing growing frustration with our allies.
When you say a lack of capability of bringing something to the table, are you referencing our lack of defense and security capability?
All of them.
Our intelligence capability?
Yeah. And that's a problem because in many cases, Canada very rarely operates alone. We operate with allies, and our first and most important foreign policy interest is to be and to be perceived as a reliable ally by our allies. And when that frustration mounts, it's a vital national interest that is being threatened for us.
I know that yesterday in the Financial Times, a NATO official said that 2/3 of NATO members are going to meet their 2% commitment this year. Canada is decidedly not in that 2/3, and that was in the context of increasing alarm about a potential outcome in the U.S. election later on this year. So, you know, these things are very, very timely right now. Would you not agree?
To the list of niche capabilities that Professor Carvin mentioned, I would add CSC. Which is a very well-respected agency abroad, our Signals Intelligence National Cryptological Agency. It is very good and it is respected by our allies.
You know, you mentioned, you didn't use the term machinery of government, you used the term governance in your opening remarks about rearranging things within the Government of Canada and how its central agencies and departments interact, how its intelligence community works. You mentioned the 4 parts of the intelligence community and the Canadian government. What specific machinery of government changes would you recommend?
That's a very good question.
We have a book.
Well, first of all, I would mention that Professor Carvin and I wrote together a book on intelligence analysis and policy making, which focuses specifically on these angles, and we do have a full chapter making some recommendations. I think the first recommendation has got to be a comprehensive review. I mean, that's not a concrete recommendation, but we need to have a serious and systematic effort to look at everything we're doing in terms of foreign policy and national security policy, generally, but including the machinery dimension. A lot of our structures are dated, and they reflect yesterday's
review has been going on now for some time. Why does it always take so long in Canada and it doesn't take nearly this long in other G7 countries?
Very briefly, please, because we're out of time.
I would say political direction and the lack of a pressing need to do, the lack of a perceived pressing need to do it.
Thank you. We next go to MP Chattel. You have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I know that Mr. Bonifant does not have the right headsets. However, I would ask a few questions, and perhaps some witnesses may be able to answer them. Good evening, Mr. Bonifant. I see you on the screen. I know that you cannot answer these questions orally now during this committee meeting, but I will read the questions out to you because I would very much like to know more about your experience, and perhaps we could correspond. You could correspond with the committee and provide your answers in writing. Mr. Bonifant, first, you have been a career diplomat since 1986. You served in New Delhi, Kuwait, New York City. You were a spokesperson for the President of the Republic before becoming an ambassador to India and Spain. You were director for North Africa and the Middle East and advisor to the Prime Minister. But what piqued the interest of this community is the fact that in March 2023, the Foreign Service Review occurred, and you led this review. The review led to a 288-page report. My first question to you is, could you give us an idea of this overview, its objectives, and more specifically, how this work was updated and adapted to diplomatic capacity? The second question I have is, how has this report tried to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of diplomatic efforts of France in dealing with global questions and crises which are complex? One of the factors of specific interest to me is how is the climate crisis affecting geopolitics with climate refugees, as they're now called? All of this has a lot of impact as a result of climate change. My third question is, given your participation, and we'll be sending all of these questions to you in writing. I see that you're quickly writing notes, but we'll send you the questions in writing. But given your participation in the Foreign Service Review and the Review of Diplomacy in France, what lessons do you think Canada could learn from this experience, as Canada is looking at the future of its own capacities and services in diplomacy? The other two questions that I have are, can you list the main lessons learned or best practices identified during your review, which could perhaps be of use to other countries, including, of course, Canada, so as to shape the future of diplomacy? And finally, given the dynamic nature of international relations, how do you see the development of the role of diplomatic services in response to the new challenges and opportunities in the world? These are the questions I had for you, Mr. Bonnefond. So again, welcome to our committee. Even if we have encountered some technical difficulties, unfortunately, because of the standards for headsets. This being said, I would be most interested to read what you will be able to write back to the committee, and we'll be sending you an email about this. So now I would like to turn to Ms. Carvin and Mr. Junot. You see where my interest is, and including climate change and geopolitical change. If you have anything to say to the committee on this subject?
I suppose, thank you. I'm very sorry. Je parle le français d'Oshawa.
I speak French from Oshawa, so that's not real French.
Strong accent. I will reply in English. With regards to these issues, I do think that we cannot function without improving the core capacities of the organization. It doesn't matter what the issue is. I mean, Professor Junot and myself, we both study national security. It's kind of where our interests lie. But fundamentally, I mean, obviously, climate is going to greatly impact national security. It's going to have a huge impact in geopolitical shifts. But we can't address any of this unless I think we address the kind of the core competencies of the organization. And this is what I worry about. And perhaps in relating to what Mr. Chong said earlier, I do worry that we are attending these international forums and not bringing our best ideas to the table. You know, where is our voice? Are we providing, we have shown leadership in some areas, but again, that leadership, I worry, is not being sustained. I worry that, it tends to be kind of what's in the headlines and where can we go from that. I do believe there's a lot of work behind the headlines, but that's not useful if it's always just constantly behind the headlines. So, and this kind of speaks then to the transparency and communications aspect to foreign affairs that I think is also lacking. So I would suggest that we need to provide better direction, provide better training and capacity, and yeah, I mean, it's hard to disagree with any of your questions. I'm not sure I have any great insight, but I would just note that, again, and I think I'm slightly biased from my recent travel to Japan, but I note their diplomats, once they're hired, they immediately spend 2 years abroad as a part of their training. I don't think that's going to be something that Canadian diplomats do soon, but I mean, it gives them incredible exposure. And not only was that really inspiring to me, but I was sad because I found out of all the individuals I spoke with in their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, only one had chose to come to Canada.
I've been holding this up for some time. If you could wrap it up. Thank you. Terribly sorry for the interruption. Next, we go to Monsieur Bergeron. Vous avez 6 minutes.
You have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. What a pity that we cannot hear from Ambassador Bonnefond. My intention was to ask him various questions, just like my colleague. I don't know whether he's still with us. If he's still online, perhaps he could let us know, because I would like to ask him. Your Excellency, I'm so happy to see you, and I'm very, very sorry for the technical difficulties which have made it impossible for you to participate in today's session. Thank you for your patience. I have various questions to ask you, and perhaps you could answer in writing. France has had all kinds of recent diplomatic incidents, especially in Africa. The last French militias, military employees left Nigeria after 10 years of struggling against the jihad in Sahel. We've also seen what's happened in Mali, Burkina Faso. What has happened to make France, who I would say was a power with a positive footprint in Africa, what has happened to have this happen to France? What happened such that French diplomacy ended with this situation? In 2023, the Foreign Service Review, the review of the French diplomacy which you led, published a 288-page and a cover letter for the report. You said that you were proposing two series of measures to modernize the instruments and methods and to modernize human resource policies. One recommendation indicates greater cooperation with elected officials in Parliament, and more specifically relating to parliamentary diplomacy. How is France using parliamentary diplomacy to increase its influence? And here, in Canada, we have an issue resulting the delegation of a parliamentary mission to Ukraine. I think that most states friendly to Ukraine already have designated a parliamentary mission to Ukraine. Canada has not yet done so. To your mind, what can parliamentary missions to a country at war such as Ukraine accomplish? What kind of contribution can they make? And last question, and this is regarding another recommendation involving the need to invest in cultural diplomacy as well as scientific and economic diplomacy. How is cultural diplomacy helping France in its influence in the world? I'd be very interested in hearing what you have to say on this subject, Your Excellency. And again, we are deeply sorry for the situation that has occurred today. Thank you very much for being with us, and thank you for your patience. Chair, I would like to ask a question of Mr. Junot. I asked this question of Senator Bem this week. As you may know, Mr. Junot, Senator Bem, who chairs the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs, published a report on, not the senator, but the committee published a report on diplomacy, and we invited him here to talk to us about this Senate committee report. In one of the report's recommendations, it says that Global Affairs Canada should promote the equal use of French and English in the department, ensure the foreign language training for employees with ab initio status, and ensure official languages training offered to other employees, including employees in Canada and those recruited on site. Two questions on the subject. We've heard of a way that senior officials do not have to be bilingual. They can get around this obligation. Is this something that you have heard of? And is this something that may diminish the status of French in Global Affairs Canada? And more often than not in Ottawa, the Prime Minister, ministers, and senior officials speak and participate in conferences or in the work of this committee and do so almost exclusively in English. What message is this sending to the diplomatic community working in Ottawa? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour.
Thank you for your questions. I read the Senate committee report. In general, it was a very good report, and I found that the committee's efforts to examine issues which are not necessarily sensationalist and attention-getting, but are essential. Issues of machinery, to use that word, the administrative capacity. I think it was an excellent effort, and I hope that this committee will continue in the same lines because, as I mentioned in my testimony, it's fine to have strategic objectives for foreign policy or national security or defense, but if you don't have any machinery in place, you cannot implement anything. So this was a good contribution to the debate. Is there a way around the requirement for senior officials at Global Affairs? I do not know. Language issues are not something that I study in the public service, so I'm not in a position to answer that question. Anecdotally, I would say that in my experience as a former civil servant, because I spent 11 years at National Defense, and now I've been a professor for about 10 years, Global Affairs was the most bilingual departments in town. It's far from perfect, but better than many other places. But specifically in terms of what you're referring to, I don't know.
For your time, Mr. Percheron.
Oui.
It's 6:37 now.
Merci.
We now go to MP McPherson. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of the witnesses. And I, as well, am sorry that we're not able to hear from His Excellency. I was very interested, Professor Carvin, in some of the things that you were saying around, the failure for us to have policies in place. Obviously, I've been calling for the feminist foreign policy to come forward for a very long time, and just how the implications are in terms of our self-interest, like Canada's self-interest, but also our relationships and what we're trying to build. And one of the things that I'm curious about, I was listening to someone tell me about a story about a general, a 3-star general, who had talked about the need for development and diplomacy as being one of those key frameworks for defense. Like that was actually one of those cornerstones. If we did that then, I think even this committee heard from David Beasley from the World Food Program about you can pay now for what needs to be done, or you can pay 1,000 times more at a later date, in the cost of conflict and whatnot. So I'm wondering, when we look at our diplomatic corps, when we look at the machinery and all of those pieces that are part of that, the failure to invest in development, the failure to invest in human rights, in addition to perhaps the failure in defense, what are the implications of that for Canada?
I think it's significant, and just because I've spoken about national security and defense, it's just my area of expertise more so. But I would agree with the general with the one proviso that I do worry that we don't want to securitize development. We want to make sure that there is that arm's length between that this isn't seen as a military tool or a national security tool. So I think that's the one thing we do have to be careful. But yeah, I mean, we often talk about the 2% budget. We don't often talk about the foreign aid budget, which is, I don't even think, I think it's at
0.7 is what we're hoping for, but we've never gotten close.
Right, exactly. So I think, yeah, this does hurt us. And where do we see this? The United Nations. And not everyone, okay, we can have a whole discussion about where we are in the United Nations and things like that. But if this is an area where we want to show leadership, where we want to bring in states that are questioning our commitment to international organizations or norms or things like that, and they're not seeing us pay these things, that does ultimately affect our capacity to then build conversations, build relationships, and things like this. I think I was particularly disappointed when we downgraded our Africa strategy to a framework. I think that's bad. And it was interesting. And again, I'm sorry to keep referencing my trip to Japan. It was excellent. Highly recommend it if you. But it's one of the things someone even said is that this is an area where Canada could potentially even show leadership. Someone suggested there could be a quad in Africa, not in terms of the development, in terms of human rights and things like that, where Australia, Japan, Canada, and Korea could work together in order, to provide an alternative to perhaps China or other kind of authoritarian states that are gaining ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And we heard news reports that the Senate committee has actually heard that Canada is becoming almost irrelevant in Africa, which is of course not where we would like to see Canada be. I'm going to ask really quickly, Ms. Dief, online. Now, I know you had also you'd spoken a lot about the implications. Like, what are the implications when Canada applies international law, applies international standards differently in different contexts? So I'd like to put that same question to you. From what we're seeing in Israel and Palestine with the horrific situation happening right now in Rafah and in Gaza, what are the implications when the rest of the world sees Canada acting deeply different in different circumstances?
Thank you for the question. I mean, we simply do not appear to be a principled and impartial actor. And so we lose our credibility to engage. We lose our ability to highlight laws of war violations and other conflicts. We lose our leverage with states, and we also, most importantly, we let down victims. And we see this, for example, the Human Rights Council session will happen in a couple of weeks. Canada will be in a very difficult position, as well as other Western states, in pushing for the renewal of a very important commission of inquiry on Ukraine, because many states will see a very clear Western double standard in terms of the response to Ukraine, the use of every tool in the diplomatic toolbox, from supporting ICC investigations to targeted sanctions, and a very different, flagrantly different response with respect to serious laws of war violations in Gaza.
Professor Juneau, anything that you could add to this conversation?
Very briefly, I would just say that irrespective of our individual views on the war in Gaza, whether we want a ceasefire, whether not, whether we're more pro one side or the other, one of the consequences of this war will be major damage to Western credibility, soft power, however you want to call it. And even if you are very much pro-Israel and very much support Israeli operations, that's subjective. Objectively, and I travel to the Middle East a lot, the damage to that credibility is significant. And the more the war continues, the more that damage will accumulate. And we will have to live with this in many ways, in terms of our credibility, in terms of our ability to build coalitions, to promote objectives, and to deal with radicalization in many ways. And that, I think, objectively is true, irrespective of where we stand on the war itself.
From my perspective, I think we've also weakened, when we don't support the ICJ, we weaken the work that the ICJ is trying to do in this circumstance, but then, of course, in other circumstances as well. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, it is. Perfect timing. Thank you, MP McPherson. We now go to MP Hoback. You have 4 minutes. 4 minutes.
Okay, we'll be quick then. We'll start off with you, Ms. Carvin. You talked about students and bringing students into global affairs. Does global affairs give the universities an update of what they want to see for requirements coming out of these students when they graduate from university or do their master's program?
Yes, they do. We do not a specific list of requirements, I should be clear, but we are constantly engaging with government. It's not just myself. I mean, obviously, I teach at the vastly superior Norman Paterson School of International Affairs compared to the graduate school of at University of Ottawa. But both of our schools will engage with government regularly to figure out what skills they want our students. So, as an example, I think both Thomas and I, or Professor Juneau and I, one of the things I do is I don't have my students write 40-page essays. I have them write a one-page brief on an issue, and they think, oh, great, it's just one page. And then they see what they have to fit into one page. Yeah, exactly. But this is the kind of training that we try to provide at our schools.
Okay, and then, I've spoke with different Canadian students at other universities around the world, and one of the complaints they have is they feel it's an Ottawa-centric recruiting system, that they don't get credit for the education they get, for example, in Washington or in London or other parts of the world. Would you agree with those types of sentiments?
As someone who did all of her graduate education in the UK, yes, it's hard. And there was a while back in, I'm going to say 2005, 2006, they started the Recruitment of Policy Leaders program, which did have outreach to international capitals abroad. And for students who were studying in Washington, London, France, and places like this, there was that opportunity. But I think we could do better. But I would agree, even Calgary, BC, encouraging that kind of outreach, I think, is important.
Yeah, again, their logic was that they thought global affairs didn't want people who thought outside the box. They wanted the same type of person, just cookie cut and paste, cookie cut and paste, cookie cut and paste, and put them in there. And Thomas, I think you want to jump in on that one. So maybe
if I can just jump in, I think that touches on the point that Professor Carvin mentioned of the fact that so many entry-level positions are short-term contracts of various types. That makes it simply logistically easier to hire out from across the street in Ottawa, whether Ottawa or Carleton. If there was a more sustained, structured system to hire on an indeterminate basis through a an appropriate process, of course, then it becomes easier to tell somebody in Calgary, you can come for a full-time job, as opposed to telling somebody in Victoria, come for 90 days and then we'll see. Right?
See different people being posted abroad. What type of preparation do they think they require before they actually go abroad? So what, besides just having the security training and the basics of the job training, what kind of background training are they doing in regards to the country they're going into, the region they're representing or working in, different diasporas, things like that? Do you work with them, and do you know of any think tanks that they're working with in this type of area?
I have not studied extensively their training program, so I can't speak to it in a systematic way, but I've worked with them quite a lot. I provide training on the Middle East, on international security issues, on other issues on a regular basis. It's quite an elaborate system, but there's always the issue of, do they have enough resources to really provide the diplomats with the training they need, linguistic or otherwise? And the other issue, and anytime there is an era of budget austerity, then training is always the low-hanging fruit. The other issue for me with training, and this is something that I have thought a bit about on the intelligence side too, is the lack of accountability on training, the lack of performance measurement. We send people on training and then we tick the box. And there is extremely limited effort to measure the outcome of training. I recognize that that is very difficult, but it's not being done.
I just came out of South Korea, and they write an exam and an essay before they take any job just to apply. So there is an outcome-based system there. Thank you.
We next go to MP Zuberi. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to start off with Ms. Daif. And you raised consular issues in a region of the world we don't actually often talk about in this committee and in the public space. And it brings me back to the cases of a number of Canadians years ago. Cases like that of Meher Rar and Abdullah Maliki Ahmed Almaty, Muayyad Nuruddin, and also of Omar Khader. And all of these individuals were dealing with extremely heavy labels, and there was a cloud over them. And we have, at the same time, I think about human rights instruments, charter values, the rule of law for all, even when it's challenging and difficult. You raise the issue of those in northeast Syria. I'd like to have your opinion. You contrasted that with consular services in general, but I'd like to contrast that with those who have found themselves in an analogous situation to people with heavy labels, as in northeast Syria. Do you see a distinction between consular services for them, these individuals, and others with heavy labels as those in northeast Syria are facing today?
Thank you for the question. I think what's clear is that there are certain consular files where there is very little political will, that the government essentially just simply wants to manage the file and not actually solve it. So where there is no political will on the part of this government to repatriate Canadians with suspected ISIS ties, especially the men, that message is trickled down to every layer of global affairs. You have a very junior, Ms. Carvin's point, a very junior consular officer who was tasked with this file, who was tasked with a very complex file, a counterterrorism file, et cetera, that involves Canadians who are in conditions that the UN has said amount to torture, inhumane and degrading treatment. So, of course, would require a much more complex set of skills. But essentially, for a file that is tricky, you see a very slow response by Global Affairs, very little in the way of consular support, very little in the way of support to family members. I spoke to a family member yesterday who lives in Ottawa, who has been desperate to even meet with her consular caseworker for, years now. And it's simply because the message given to Global Affairs, given to the consular team is clearly that this is not a high priority issue, that the Prime Minister is not keen to repatriate these Canadian nationals. They're treated very differently than other cases of evacuations. These same family members who have loved ones who have been detained in northeast Syria for 7 years have seen this government put forward a global declaration on arbitrary detention, have seen this government evacuate hundreds of nationals from many war zones around the world, but yet their families are left behind, their loved ones are left behind very intentionally.
Thank you. And Mr. Janot, I'd like to just ask you, what have we learned about dealing with people who have a cloud over them as these individuals in northeast Syria? What have we learned in the last 20 years about how to deal with these individuals when I think of, for example, what some countries in the Middle East have done to de-radicalize people? Do you have any commentary?
I don't know if you do, but that's beyond my expertise. Sorry about that.
Very briefly, if you do have a response.
Ms. Carvin.
I would be happy to discuss with you offline. I actually think Canada has been a fairly big pioneer in the space of countering radicalization. I do have concerns about some of the programs in Saudi Arabia and things like that. I'm not sure that they're the models we'd want to go for, but definitely we should be talking with those countries. And I would just reiterate the call to repatriate these individuals and through a frame, and if necessary, prosecute them through criminal law and not a black hole. Thank you.
Thank you. So next we go to Mr. Bergeron. You have 2 minutes.
Merci. Très rapidement.
Thank you. Very briefly. Mr. Junot, what I was saying is that I find this terrifying. If a Senate committee decided to make this recommendation about the use of French, that means that things aren't going very well at global affairs. And if GAC is one of the best examples that exist, I just can't even imagine what's going on in the other government departments. My next question is for Ms. Dave. The Minister of Foreign Affairs has said that Canada's foreign policy would be guided by 2 principles, sovereignty and pragmatic diplomacy, which means working with countries, and I'm quoting in essence, with different perspectives while never compromising Canadian interests and national interests. My question is simple. Isn't this trying the impossible? In other words, working with countries who have different perspectives, countries who openly violate human rights, without compromising Canadian values, which are to respect human rights, among other things? How do you react to that?
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron, for the question. Yes, undoubtedly there are a certain number of countries that are grave violators of international human rights that continue to be very strong allies of Canada. We have, it was interesting that prior to the case of extrajudicial execution, the alleged case of extrajudicial execution on Canadian soil involving a Canadian Sikh man, we had been pleading with this government for years to scrutinize India's human rights record, to engage at the UN Human Rights Council around attacks against religious minorities in India, intimidation, harassment, extrajudicial killings, etc. But unfortunately, that didn't come to fruition until this issue landed on our soil, which will often happen if we don't actually take preventative steps to address human rights violations, even those that are committed by our allies.
Thank you. We next go to MP McPherson. You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes is very fast, so I'm going to ask 2 really hard questions and then wish you all luck. The first question is about our arms sales and what it says about our diplomatic relationships with other countries when we prioritize arms to Turkey, Israel, India, Saudi Arabia versus looking at our responsibilities under the ATT, the Arms Trade Treaty, and human rights requirements. And I would also love some insight from you as experts on where Canada is diplomatically with regards to other challenges we see in the Middle East, like the Houthis and Iran. Maybe Ms. Deef, I'll start with you. Go.
Yeah, it was very welcome that you've pushed forward a motion, certainly, that got accepted around arms sales to Israel. I mean, I think it's incredibly important to assess risks, to constantly have a arms control regime that's rooted in human rights, that's rooted in risks. And so essentially with the ICJ decision on plausible genocide, it only underscores the need for Canada to review arms sales to Israel, to ensure that they're suspended insofar as there's impunity for grave crimes that are being committed. And that should be the case across the board.
Professor Juneau?
The case of Canada resuming weapon sales to Turkey for me is a good example of how foreign policy is about balancing competing priorities. Human rights is one of them, should be one of them, but is not the only one. One of Canada's most important foreign policy interests is NATO. Being our standing within NATO and a functioning NATO, and NATO enlargement to me is consistent with that. So as long as Turkey was withholding approval of Sweden's entry into NATO, I was completely in favor of of suspending these sales. As part of these negotiations, my understanding is that for a number of allies, including the US and us, perhaps others, resuming these weapon sales was a condition after.
Even if it breaks our international or Canadian law around the ATT?
I'm not an expert on the ATT, so I'm not in a position to make that specific judgment. From a foreign policy perspective, for me, it made sense. It's unpalatable. It's not fun. But in the world we're in today, a functioning NATO, which is under threat, including from within, is an overriding interest for us. So it's not nice, but to me, that was ultimately the right call.
Thank you. We next go to Mr. Abultaif. You have 4 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. Dr. Jennifer Welsh, Director of Center for International Peace and Security Studies at McGill, said to this committee that Canadians are living in an international system that is less hospitable to our interests and our values. The question is, have we left the camp, or we were left behind, or we have done something wrong to be living in an international system that is less hospitable to our values and our interests?
To be honest, I think we've gotten a bit lazy. Because it's not so much that we don't care, but are we consistent? Like, it's like a house. It's like you move into your house, you enjoy the house, but you have to occasionally replace the windows and redo the roof and things like this. And I just think we've gotten lazy, or assuming that this infrastructure would always be there and that we could always be a part of it. And we need to have capacity in our Global Affairs Department to ensure that renewal can consistently take place.
Do you care to comment on this, please?
I would agree with how Professor Carvin just phrased this. I think we lived living under the U.S. defense and security umbrella for decades has made us dilettantes in foreign policy. It's been easy. We have neglected foreign policy. We have made bad decisions on foreign policy and not paid a price for decades. And that's over.
Thank you. There's different types of diplomacy. The Minister of Foreign Affairs talked about pragmatic diplomacy. There's also other type called dollar diplomacy. What are we doing? Are we really doing with pragmatic diplomacy enough that we can reserve our space or spot in the world among our allies and among the international community? And are we doing enough of dollar diplomacy? Yes or no? Dr. Juneau, then Dr. Carvin.
Just to be clear, what do you mean exactly by dollar diplomacy?
Well, dollar diplomacy is one of the ways that countries use to get their way through, to get some influence on the international stage. And if we're falling behind and we don't put enough resources, that could be one of the reasons why we're not doing so well.
Very briefly, whatever reforms we implement on machinery issues, whatever we do in terms of what Professor Carvin was mentioning in terms of better defining our foreign policy interests and objectives and so on, without money, without resources for diplomacy, for defense, and I would add for intelligence and national security, we are only going to partially be able to defend our interests. There is very simply a need to invest more.
Dr. Carvin, please.
I would agree that I would refer to the comments and discussion I had with Ms. McPherson, in that development matters in these conversations, particularly with our non-Western allies, and we don't seem to pay attention to that. I don't know if I like calling it dollar diplomacy. Definitely, we kind of refer to that in, some people talk about the debt trap in Africa with regards to China and how they're providing money that will never be repaid. There's definitely steps there that we could be taking, especially with our allies, in terms of outreach to those countries.
If I ask you as an academic to explain or to define pragmatic diplomacy in short words, would you be able to do so?
Pragmatic diplomacy is diplomacy, and first of all, pragmatic diplomacy can mean whatever you want it to mean. I think that's the key point. When a politician usually defines something like that, to me it means we will, dismiss principles, objectives, strategies, and play it as it goes. In theory, pragmatic diplomacy would mean that ideology and values take the back seat.
Tamaj, is the expert. I would leave it to him. I agree. I think when we say, the only thing I would caution is we say pragmatic, it could be anything. It's a very ship-shifting form. There is a role for values and human rights in our foreign policy. It has to be there. Otherwise, I think we've talked about being hypocritical. We also don't want to be seen as being cynical.
Thank you.
We now go to MP Oliphant. 4 minutes, please.
Mr. Algabra.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know if you still want to split my time. Okay. Only because we need to leave half an hour for committee business as well.
Okay. So point of order. I just want to check on our process because at 6 o'clock, I thought we had half an hour of committee business.
We started at 10 to 5.
The question was, what time then are you assuming we will end the meeting?
We will wrap this up in approximately 20 minutes.
And so I'm asking, when will we begin our committee business time? Because I thought we could end this time early. We haven't had a discussion about that.
If I said it, we have another 20 minutes left for this, that means we will start the committee business in approximately 20 minutes.
Could you canvass the committee whether or not that is the will of the committee? I'm just wondering whether we want another 2 rounds, which I think that's a 1.5 round, which that was, if we could maybe finish 1 round.
1 more round? Is everyone in favor of just finishing off after?
Are you okay? Did you see the headings?
No, we're not. We were just going to do 2 hours, but we started at 10 minutes to 5, correct?
Our perspective is that this is our last.
You guys want to eliminate the last round then?
Yeah.
If we can finish this round, and then that would be the last round.
Then, so you're talking about 1 more additional round?
No, I'm saying we started this round with the Conservatives, and then the Liberal, and then it would be then we're done.
Oh, okay. So
they're okay to be finished?
No, that's third round. So this is the second round, right? This is you are the concluding member for the second round.
I think we're in the third round.
No, we're not. We're in the second round right now.
Liberals get 2 questions in second.
Okay.
Who's on first?
I'm not so good at rounds.
You are the concluding questioner for round 2.
Okay.
This is the third round.
Okay. Luckily, it was a point of order. But if this is our last round, I just wanted to check: is this the last questioner right now?
Yes.
Does everyone agree that this should be the last question? Okay. Mr. Algabra?
Then, as much as I wanted to ask questions, but I'll cede my time to my colleague, Hedy Fry.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Omar, and thank you, Rob, for ceding the round to me. I'm going to take this opportunity, actually, to move a motion that you all have, which is pertinent to what we're studying right now. And it says that my motion you have says that as part of the study on Canada's diplomatic capacity, the Foreign Affairs and International Development Committee recognize international development to be an inherent part of Canada's diplomatic strategy and affirm its support for reproductive and sexual health rights around the world, recognizing that the right to safe and legal reproductive care is a right to health care, condemns any effort to limit or remove sexual and reproductive rights, and emphasize the importance of maintaining access to reproductive and sexual health care, including safe abortions and contraceptives, as a main component of Canada's international feminist assistance policy. So moved.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fry. First of all, would everyone like me to thank our witnesses at this point, because there's no more questions for them? So at this juncture, Professor Carvin, Professor Jeannot, Ms. Deef, thank you very, very much for having appeared before us. You have given us much to think of. Also, Mr. Ambassador, thank you ever so much for having joined us. Our sincerest apologies for the technical problems, but we're grateful to each and every one of you. Thank you. Now, Dr. Fry, you obviously have not provided 48 minutes notice for this motion. However, I would like to hear from you how you believe that this specific motion falls within the scope of Canada's diplomatic capacity, please.
I think that if you listened to our witnesses today and the witnesses in the last meeting, they were discussing that, in fact, for our diplomatic capacity is about us providing foreign aid. And this is part of our foreign aid package. So this is clearly a part of our diplomatic efforts abroad. How do we, I mean, we even had a question from Mr. Boutev about what do you mean by dollar diplomacy? This is about providing foreign aid. And so this is very core and pertinent to this particular study we are doing right now. So I don't need to provide 48 hours notice. This is in order.
Thank you, Dr. Fry. Yes, MP Chong.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, on a point of order, I don't think this is in order. I think it would be in order at the next meeting of the committee, because the 48 hours notice would have been given. This motion was put on notice today. I don't believe it fits the rubric of the business at hand, which is the future of Canada's, which is Canada's diplomatic capacity. And, you know, I don't think abortion and reproductive rights fit into that current study that we're presently on right now. And so, you know, my view is that, you know, this motion should be considered at the next meeting of this committee rather than now, just because the preamble makes reference to the study in front of us doesn't mean that the motion is in order. So I think it's out of order. I think it will be in order at our next meeting. Seeing that 48 hours notice would have been given at that point, but I don't think it's in order now.
Thank you, MP Chong. Did anyone else want to speak to this issue? Yes, Mr. Bergeron.
D'abord, je suis d'accord avec.
First of all, I agree with Mr. Chong. I think that the rule for motions applies here for substantive motions. While I'm highly receptive to the content of the motion, I have two questions. One, aren't we putting the cart before the horse? In that ultimately there would be a report, and in a few moments we'll be looking at the drafting instructions for the report, so there will be recommendations. Perhaps this could be the subject of recommendations passed by the committee, or an opinion expressed, or a dissident opinion. And my second question is, we have just conducted an in-depth study of reproductive and sexual rights of women. And I wonder what the added value is of this motion. But because this motion is out of order, I won't debate it for any longer. But I submit my questions. Thank you.
If I may be permitted to answer the question?
We will have to go to Pearson
Okay, go ahead.
first.
Sorry about that, Heather.
I must say, what Mr. Bergeron has said makes eminent sense. However, the question before us is whether this motion falls within the scope of what we have been discussing. But yes, from a practical standpoint, very good point, Mr. Bergeron, yes.
For my perspective, I mean, I think that it fits in as we are actually trying to bring this forward. Like, we are actually trying to give the drafting instructions to the analysts today. That's why I think that it does make sense. And we certainly heard, or I tried to tease out the importance throughout this study of development as being part of our diplomacy. You know, obviously the cornerstone of Canada's development work is the FAAE, the Feminist International Assistance Policy. That is the policy under which all of our development is happening. So I do think it does make sense for us to bring this forward as we are providing drafting instructions to the analysts for their preparation.
MP Chung?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I don't believe we're in the drafting instructions part of the meeting. We are in the Canada's diplomatic capacity public part of the meeting. And so if we want to go to drafting instructions, that's very well and fine. But again, you know, we're in the public part of the meeting.
I would have to say I do agree with you, Mr. Chong, and I also agree with Mr. Bergeron. Right now, all that is before this committee is to determine whether the motion that has been brought before us falls within the scope of the issue of Canada's diplomatic capacity. Yes, Dr. Fryer.
Thank you. I wish to say that regardless of whether we're drafting or not, this is fully within the scope of what we're talking about. We heard witnesses speak to the issue of Canada having to defend human rights as part of our diplomatic capacity. It was decided way back in 1995 that women's rights were human rights, that sexual and reproductive rights are an important part of human rights. If we're going to talk about a diplomatic capacity that entertains human rights, this has to be on the table, because around the world currently right now, we see that human rights of women are being denied. We look at Africa. We're going to travel to Africa, but we look at what's happening in Africa. We know that 78,000 women a year in that part of the world and in the developing world die from unsafe abortions. But they also die because they're having their 20th child, and their uterus is like a piece of paper, and they bleed postpartum hemorrhage, and they die, and their children suffer as a result of it. So it's an important part of our diplomatic capacity of human rights.
I hate
being
to interrupt my
part
colleague, but I have a point of order, which takes precedence. In the point of order, I would just preface it by saying I'll be fully supportive of this motion when it comes, but I believe right now our order of business is on a point of order on whether or not it is within the scope of the study. I think that is not a debatable piece. If there's a contestation to that, we can have the debate on the point of order, but not on the subject of the matter. So I would think it'd be important for the chair to rule on whether it's in order, and then we could have maybe a quick discussion about whether we need to vote on this today or whether or not we need to get to our business meeting. But I think that there is a question about validity, and that is yours to rule on.
I appreciate that, but we can listen to what members have to say as to whether it does fall within the scope of Canada's diplomatic capacity.
On points of order, yes. But if we're... Yeah, but we have to, I would just challenge that we should not debate the motion at this point and present that. It's only on whether or not it falls into the scope of the study.
I keep reminding everyone that this is the only question before us, is whether it falls within the scope of Canada's diplomatic capacity. Yes, and I think Dr. Fry actually spoke to that very issue. Anyone else want to say? I would have to say, having heard everyone, in particular Dr. Fry, And it's not just a question of wording, but everything that has been highlighted, that yes, it does fall within the scope of Canada's diplomatic capacity. Is everyone okay with that? Okay. Yes. Yes. Did anyone want to challenge it? No? Okay. So did we want to did we want to suspend for a few minutes before coming back to committee business? Yes, MP Chateau. So just 3-4 minutes and then we'll be back? Yes, in camera. What's that?
Is the motion now on the floor or not on the floor?
Well, yes, the motion has been adopted. Listen, yes, because it. Yes.
No, I don't.
Yeah. Sorry.
I just want to be clear
Yes, sorry,
that I believe the chair. You've ruled it's an order that was not challenged.
Yeah, we haven't
So we have to go back to the motion, and the motion needs to be dealt with.
Yes,
before
correct.
we can move to committee business.
Yes, correct.
No,
Sorry.
I think the chair has ruled that it's within the scope of the study. And since the next item on the agenda is the review drafting instructions for the analysts, that we're now going to move in camera where I assume we will continue debate on the motion.
What's that?
No, the motion
It's
was.
fine. That's what he said.
Members want to debate the motion now.
We would like to debate the motion.
You'd like to debate the motion?
Are
Absolutely.
we going
Mr.
in
Chair.
camera or are we staying in public? Either way is fine by me.
Well, if we're debating it, then that
Has to be in public.
we
I
remain in public.
moved it in public.
Just wanting to clarify from the chair, I believe we are still in a public meeting. We've not moved in camera. We have a motion on the floor, which you have ruled is eligible to be debated. So I think we're now in debate.
Yes,
that
correct.
debate will continue as long as a member has something they want to say about it.
Correct.
Unless something else happens.
Absolutely.
So that was my point, that I think we are into this. And if the committee wanted to vote on it quickly to get us to business, I would love that, because I think the business is really important, because we have a break week coming up, and if we could give the analysts instructions today, I think that would be helpful to get this report done. And there's a few other things I think in the business meeting we need to get done. But I believe right now we're on that. I will simply say I am supportive of this motion, and I don't need to say more than that.
Thank you. Mr. Chong, sorry, did you want to speak to this as well? Yes, Mr. Chong.
Yeah, I don't think that this motion is being done in a constructive, was introduced in a constructive manner. I think it was dropped at the last minute. It is part of a pattern of division on part of this.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. You ruled that this motion is in order. I think Mr. Chong is debating the problem of whether it's in order or not, and he should be debating the substance of the motion. Thank you.
I am not, Mr. Chair. I am not, Mr. Chair. I am debating the substance of the motion. I think the substance of this motion is very divisive, and I think it's part of a broader pattern on part of this government to defend itself by introducing divisive measures in the House and in committees in order to distract from its failings. And so I don't think this motion is a constructive motion in the context of the diplomatic capacity study. I would note that it was a different form of the motion was introduced previously at this committee, and the committee descended into chaos. And so we are once again taking the committee off track because this motion clearly doesn't have a consensus around this table. And I would note, actually, that that's unfortunate, because I think in Canada's foreign aid that it is possible to develop a consensus across party lines and amongst Canadians more broadly. And the approach that I would highlight that I think the committee should have taken when it comes to these sorts of issues is the approach that the previous government took with its G8 Muskoka initiative on maternal and children's health, an initiative that was widely seen as being successful precisely because both NGOs and the government set aside their partisan considerations and actually worked across divides to find a consensus on issues of commonality. And I was just reviewing recently an article that was written by Ellie Vandenberg in Policy Options in 2017. Ellie Vandenberg is a professor at the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. She has 25 years of experience at World Vision Canada, and she wrote something that I think is particularly apt in this context of the motion in front of us today. She highlighted 10 practical lessons learned from the success of the Muskoka initiative. One of the 10 lessons learned was to collaborate across different divides and to focus on areas of common support. And that's not what this motion does. It does quite the opposite, actually. It's a divisive motion that we have dealt with in another form at this committee. And, I think that doesn't build on the lessons learned from the successful Muskoka initiative that was something that really not just galvanized NGOs across Canada and not just galvanized the international development community here in Canada, but also the community outside of Canada, and played a big role in helping us move towards the Millennium Development Goals that we had been struggling to meet as we were at the two-thirds point around 2010. And so, we know that in the aftermath of the pandemic, the world's poorest have suffered disproportionately. The World Bank, I believe, last year highlighted that tens of millions of people slid back below the extreme poverty line as a result of the pandemic. And so there is a need for a doubling down on the effort to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, and previously the Millennial Development Goals that were set.
Point of order? Yes. Sorry to interrupt.
Madam McPherson.
Sorry to interrupt my colleague. I would just like to ask that we adjourn, knowing that it is Valentine's Day and we all have loved ones I'm sure we'd like to spend time with. I'd like to put forward a motion to adjourn.
That's out of order at this point when Mr. Chong is... Yes.
Sorry.
Mr. Chair, I'm finished speaking. Thank you.
Sorry, what did I have?
Mr. Chair, I'm finished.
Give me the
I'm done my
information.
intervention, Mr. Chair. You may recognize the next person.
Yes, MP McPherson.
I would like to call to adjourn.
Thank you. No.
No, that. But on
Well, it's done.
the
Yeah. Everyone's in favor of adjourning? Excellent. Meeting stands adjourned.